Former Middle East correspondent and University of Queensland professor Peter Grester worked in Gaza. He told me earlier Israel needs to provide evidence Hamas was operating from the building.
I worked in Gaza Strip, in fact, some years ago. I don't think I worked in this particular building, but I have been I have worked out of buildings in Gaza, and I know just how those places operate. It's the Israelis have said that they have evidence that the buildings were being used by Hamas, and Hamas was using the media buildings as a cover for their own intelligence gathering operations. But as we've heard in that setup package, the Israelis haven't provided any concrete evidence, and certainly nothing that would satisfy the media freedom groups or the news organisations that were affected by these attacks. And so in the absence of any evidence, it's hard to see it as anything other than an attack on press freedoms, an attempt to silence journalists that are operating in Gaza itself. But let's assume for a moment that, in fact, what the Israelis are saying is legitimate. And to be fair, Hamas does have a record of placing military installations, military facilities in civilian areas. And so it wouldn't be surprising if this were the case. I think it's also worth noting that the news organisations themselves have been operating out of those buildings for years, for 10, 15 years, some of them. And they've all insisted that they haven't been aware of anything that would suggest that Hamas was using those buildings as a facility of some sort. But I still think that it's incredibly important for Israel to make sure that they protect and support and allow the media to operate, to do its job. Israel continually insists that it's the only democracy in the Middle East, that it has constitutional protections for press freedom and freedom of expression. And it needs to, if it's going to be seen to be true to those principles, and it needs to make sure that the media is able to continue to operate, even if that means providing safe houses for the journalists to operate itself.
Do you think it's going to be harder now for the international community to know what's going on, given the building has been destroyed, a number of television equipment and other media equipment has also been destroyed? How are the agencies going to get their information out?
Indisputably, that equipment has been destroyed. Those transmission facilities have all been destroyed, and those news organisations have lost their places to operate. Now, I'm sure that they'll work very, very hard to try and find alternative facilities. But either way, the fact is that it is incredibly difficult to set things up and to replace all those lost equipment, the lost documentation, all of the archives that those news organisations will have had. And remember, as a news organisation, it is impossible to cover a place as divided as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict by having offices on one side of the conflict, only based in, say, Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. News organisations absolutely have to have operations inside the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And in the absence of that, all we end up with is Israeli intelligence, Israeli say so on what they're doing, and Hamas's say so about what's taking place inside the Gaza Strip. It's a deeply, deeply unsatisfactory situation. It's not just for the international community; it's for international organisations like the United Nations and others. We need those independent eyes and ears to give us a clear sight about what's taking place in the region. And as I said, it really is now up to Israel to make sure that is allowed to continue.
How do you think that the journalists would have been feeling? They were given just 1 hour to pack up their things, to evacuate and leave. How do you think they're feeling?
Oh, they'll be devastated, absolutely devastated. As I said, these guys have been operating out of those buildings for years and years and years. And I know that they've got not just loads of memories, but they will have lost their archives, their records, their equipment. They'll have lost a lot of the relationships that they've formed. This is not just a physical blow to their equipment, but also a fairly heavy emotional blow as well. They'll be angry, they'll be upset. And they'll be working hard, though, I think, to find an alternative. In a way, setting up and re-establishing new offices and getting back on air is itself a form of resistance. It's a way of saying to the authorities that we're not going to be silent, we're going to be able to stop us from operating.
Peter, we saw the US president trying to ease tensions. He's reached out to both the Palestinian president and Israeli prime minister. What do you make of his intervention? Will it likely have any influence?
I think it does have influence. Look, there is no two ways about it. The US is without doubt the most important power broker within the region. It carries enormous influence over the Israelis. It's always going to be a complicated political calculus for any American president, particularly because the Israeli lobby inside the United States is so powerful and influential. But equally, the US provides enormous amounts of support, military and intelligence support and financial support to Israel. And so it does have, what the US says really matters. But I don't think just because Joe Biden steps into this is a guarantee that this thing is going to be over, the situation is going to resolve itself and that the Israelis will pull back. I think it's important to see the Americans engaged, and I think the Biden administration is much more actively involved and supportive or taking a more neutral position than the Trump administration did. And I think that's a really important aspect to this, to the conflict at the moment. But I don't think we're going to see things, we're not going to see things end anytime soon.